Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving into something that sounds, well, completely contradictory. We're talking about President Eisenhower, a guy who knew war better than almost anyone, and how his plan for peace was basically to threaten to end the world. Yeah, it's a wild one. And really, that was the heart of the problem he walked into in 1953. I mean, you've got the US and the Soviet Union just staring each other down, and the whole world is holding its breath. What do you even do in that situation? Well, Eisenhower's answer was to throw out the old playbook entirely. He came up with a totally new defense policy, a complete rethink of how America was going to handle the Cold War. He called it the New Look. And you got to remember the context here. The Korean War had been incredibly expensive in both lives and money. So Eisenhower's thinking was, how do we stop the Soviets from expanding, but without completely draining the treasury? This new look was his answer, a way to be strong and smart with the budget. And this right here really breaks it down for you. Look at the difference. The old way, a huge, super expensive army on the ground. The new look, on the other hand, okay, let's slim down the regular forces, but let's back them up with a massive nuclear arsenal. The whole idea was, as they said, to get more bang for the buck. The threat had to be so big, so unthinkable, that nobody would even think about starting something. And the core principle, the thing that made this all work, was this absolutely terrifying concept called massive retaliation. The message to the Soviets couldn't have been clearer. If you or your allies make a move on us or our allies, it doesn't matter how big or small, we might just respond with everything we've got. A full-blown nuclear attack. It was an incredible gamble, right? A peace that was only held together by the promise that if it broke, everyone would be annihilated. Okay, so that's the theory. But how did this actually look in practice? How did this new look play out around the world? Let's take a look, and we'll start with the one big idea that was driving everything. And this was it, the domino theory. You've probably heard of it. It was this powerful, simple idea that basically drove U.S. foreign policy for years. The thinking went like this. If just one country falls to communism, it's not going to stop there. It'll create a chain reaction, knocking over its neighbors one by one. And this fear, this image of falling dominoes, really shaped what the U.S. did next, especially over in Southeast Asia. So to stop those dominoes from even starting to wobble, Eisenhower went on the offensive. He helped build alliances like SEATO to create, a sort of team against communism in the region, and he started pumping a ton of money and military support into the anti-communist government in South Vietnam. Now, the goal was to put a wall up against communism, but as we all know now, these were the very first steps that would eventually lead the U.S. much, much deeper into Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Cold War wasn't just happening in Asia. A whole new front was opening up in the Middle East. You had all these nationalist movements bubbling up, like what we saw in Egypt during the Suez Crisis. And the big fear for the US was that the Soviet Union would see this chaos as a golden opportunity to swoop in and get control over the region's incredibly important oil reserves. So what did Eisenhower do? He responded with a policy that was so direct, they just named it after him, the Eisenhower Doctrine. In '57, he basically made a promise to the world. Any country in the Middle East that was fighting off a communist takeover, well, the U.S. would be there with military and economic help. It was a classic line in the sand moment, basically telling the Soviets this far and no further. But the fight wasn't just happening on the ground through these proxy conflicts. The rivalry was about to go to a whole new level. Literally. It became this intense, high-stakes race for technological dominance, a battle fought with rockets and spies way, way up in the sky. And then came this date. For Americans, it felt like the world had changed overnight. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the very first satellite to orbit the Earth. And that little beeping signal coming down from space, it was a massive shock. It was a wake-up call that screamed, hey, America, you're not the only ones with advanced technology anymore. You might actually be falling behind. And just like that, the space race was on. But let's be clear, this was never just about science or exploration. Not really. It was a brand new battlefield for the Cold War, a way to prove whose technology, whose ideology was superior. Eisenhower knew the U.S. had to respond, and fast. So he pushed for huge investments in science, and in 1958, he created a little agency you might have heard of, NASA. Then, just as things seemed to be maybe, just maybe, calming down a little, this happened in 1960. An American U-2 spy plane gets shot down deep inside Soviet territory. At first, the U.S. tries to play it off, like, oh, it was just a weather plane that went off course. Well, awkward, because then the Soviets went public and said, not only do we have the plane, we have the pilot, and he's alive. The whole thing was a huge embarrassment. It completely blew up a planned peace summit and just showed everyone how little trust there really was between the two sides. All right, so after 8 years of this high-wire act, where did it all leave us? What was the real legacy of Eisenhower's massive Cold War gamble? It's really a story of two sides. On the one hand, you have these incredibly confrontational, aggressive policies, massive retaliation, the spy flights, all of it. But on the other hand, this is the same president who brought the fighting in Korea to an end. He was the one who went to the Geneva summit and actually tried to talk things out, to bring the temperature down. So when you look back, his legacy is, well, it's complicated. For sure, his biggest achievement was that he managed to keep the peace between the US and the Soviet Union. There was no direct, world-ending war on his watch. But the way he did it, by making nuclear weapons the centerpiece of US defense and by getting the country more and more involved in places like Vietnam, well, that set the stage for some really serious conflicts for the presidents who came after him. Which kind of brings us back to that first big question, doesn't it? Was Eisenhower's whole nuclear gamble a stroke of genius, a brilliant way to navigate a terrifyingly dangerous world? Or was it just a reckless roll of the dice that, yeah, it worked out for him, but it also locked in the conflicts that were just around the corner?